Good evening, everyone. I'm David Sproles, president of the New York School of Interior Design, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 9th annual Michael I. and Patricia M. Sovern Lecture on Design. Before I introduce tonight's guest of honor, I would like to offer a heartfelt thank you to Patricia Sovern and her late husband, Michael, a respected legal scholar, mediator, teacher, and president of Columbia University. Pat, who is here with us tonight, is Chairman Emeritus of the New York School of Interior Design's Board of Trustees, where she served for many years as a valued member. It was through a generous gift she and Mike made to the college that we are able to endow a lecture series in their name to bring the highest caliber speakers to our stage. Pat, we thank you. I also want to mention that we will be having a reception this evening immediately following the lecture in our gallery space. Please join us there to continue the conversation and view our current exhibition, Our Practice, 11 Women in Interior Design, which closes at the end of the month. Tonight, we are excited to welcome the Sovern lecture speaker, David B. Peterson. David will be talking about what he learned writing his recent book, U.S. Embassies of the Cold War: The Architecture of Democracy, Diplomacy, and Defense. With an abundance of previously unpublished archival images, the book chronicles the U.S. State Department's design of embassies to express the American ideal of a progressive, democratic society. David will tell us about the little-known story of the State Department's bid to win international hearts and minds through the strategic use of design at the height of the international conflict between communism and democracy. In essence, using modern architecture as a powerful form of cultural diplomacy. David is the CEO of the Onera Group and founder of the Onera Foundation, an organization that seeks to inform and engage the public about historic preservation and significant architecture in the United States. He has spent the majority of his career in investment banking and serves on the board of the Harlem Academy School and the board of the Foundation for Art and Preservation in Embassies. He also serves on the advisory council for Philip Johnson's Glass House in New Canaan, Connecticut. He holds a BA from Dartmouth College, an MBA from New York University, and an MS in Historic Preservation from Columbia University. David, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to you. Thank you, and enjoy, everyone.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Pat. It's a pleasure to be here. You've had some pretty special speakers here over the past few years, and I'm honored to be part of that group. I mean that genuinely. This is a topic that I love to talk about because it's not a topic that's well known. A lot of the images, as David said, were deep in archives, so the first time they were seen were in this book. So there's the book. Anyway, thank you all for joining me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Cold War era and the context and why that's important for architecture and the embassies, cultural diplomacy and the embassy programming, the Cold War embassies themselves, and then I'll finish with the current status of the Cold War embassies and the new embassies being built. So when the Cold War began, it's very hard to say because there were no bullets fired, there were no bombs dropped, but it quickly became an all-out battle between communism and democracy. And what did it do? It created a lot of anxiety. For those that are my age and older, you probably remember Duck and Cover. I think that his name was Bert, as I remember. I think his name was Bert. That's a lot of behinds sticking up in the air. I'm not sure that's really going to save your life, but that's what we were trained to do. But that's just to say there was an enormous amount of anxiety and fear. There was a constant, literally constant barrage of advertisements and images. And of course, the world had witnessed what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the fear level was just accelerated to a very, very high level. It culminated in 1962, which some of you may know, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the closest this country has come to a nuclear exchange. There may have been others, we don't know about it, but we discovered surface-to-air missiles in Cuba. Kennedy went on the air to talk about it. It was a scary 13 days, as it was called. The UN Security Council had a showdown with the Soviet Union, and they ended up withdrawing those surface-to-air missiles 90 miles from America. It was a very, very scary time, needless to say. But it was also an era of some other things going on. We had the Red Scare. We had Joe McCarthy. It was not a good era for those in the creative community on the West Coast in particular. It was also not a good time to be gay or non-traditional in this country. There was something called the Lavender Scare, where they cleaned out over 1,000 employees from the State Department. The feeling was that those that were gay or lesbian at the day were somehow vulnerable to the Soviet Union. It's insane to think about today, but it actually existed. And that on your right is the report on, they call them sex perverts in government. I mean, it's pretty offensive, to say the least. And it was also a time of severe racial issues, probably one of the worst being the murder of Emmett Till, which still resonates in this country, but not a proud moment in this country in terms of racial issues. But it was also kind of an innocent era. It was To Kill a Mockingbird and Lassie. Actually, Lassie used to be my favorite show. I love that show. But anyway, but it was kind of an innocent time at the same time that a lot of conflict or potential conflict was going on around the world. But what was it really about? It was really about communism versus democracy. This is George Kennan, who wrote The Long Telegram in 1946. He was chargé d'affaires, which means the ambassador was not there. And he wrote an 8,000-word telegram. Just for those of you who are too young to remember, in the day, I looked it up before I got here, it was 50 cents a word. So that was $4,000 worth of a telegram, 8,000 words. Today, that would be $68,000, just to give you a level of the telegram. It's just kind of a fun stuff. But then the other thing that happened in 1950, the National Security Council issued a secret report that talked about containing communism must become the single most important item for international policy. So how do you contain communism? Well, there are a number of ways you do it. You build up your military. In 1950, we had roughly 300 warheads. By 1960, we had almost 20,000. What else do you do? Well, you gather information. We started the CIA in 1947. That's President Eisenhower at the groundbreaking, and that's the CIA headquarters. So we built up a huge international information gathering organization. Just so you know, the CIA operates outside the U.S., the FBI operates inside the U.S. And what else do you do? Well, you want to convince hearts and minds about the benefits of democracy over communism. So we started something called the U.S. Information Agency. At one time, it was the largest publisher in the world. It was one of the largest broadcasters in the world, and it was broadcasting the benefits, again, of a free and open society. But what else do you do? There's one thing left you can do to help convince hearts and minds. You build embassies around the world. Why do you build embassies? I'll talk about it in a minute. There are a number of reasons. So right after World War II, starting in 1948, we built over 25 embassies around the world. Prior to that, embassies were generally rented space, sometimes above a car garage or things like that. Typically, there were residences where the ambassador was, sometimes in the big cities, but there was not a formal embassy program at the moment. They put together a very distinguished group of architectural advisory committee. Some may know the Equitable Building. That was the first curtain wall building in America, glass curtain wall building. But a very strong architectural group to review and think about hiring the architects that were going to build these embassies. Where did they go? Well, it's interesting where they went. There was a rich source of architects and designers and others at schools like Cranbrook, Eros Saarinen, who built 2 of the embassies that I'm going to talk about, Florence Knoll, who did some of the furniture in the early embassies, the international embassies, international style, Harry Bertoia, who you'll see did some of the sculptures, and here's a studio. And also the Harvard Five in New Canaan was a rich source. Marcel Breuer, John Johansson, Philip Johnson, Noyce, and Goris were not. It's one of these SAT questions. So these were, out of the Harvard Five were people that all went to Harvard and then all built houses in New Canaan. Edward Rollstone built a house but he didn't live in New Canaan. But he went to Harvard. So anyway, it's one of those. And then the architects. So what did they do? They went out and basically, if you were putting together the all-star baseball team, the all-star football team, the best of the best, they went out and had the foresight to hire the greatest architects in the world by almost any measure. I'll go through some of the specifics of these architects in a minute, but you really couldn't put together a better group of architects at the time because there were no star architects in those days. There weren't, the kind of famous, but these were just high quality, well-known, highly qualified. And by the way, it was risky. There was no, you didn't know what these guys were going to build. You didn't know how avant-garde it was going to be. Anyway, so one of the things that was great about the embassies that you're going to see maybe for the first time is what they did in the embassies. This is a plan of the former U.S. Embassy in Oslo. Do I have my pointer here? So if you see here, there's the U.S. Information Services entrance. On the right is the console where you get your visa, you get your entrance visas to the U.S. And in the middle was the entrance for the working people in the embassy itself. And within the U.S. Information Service, they had a couple things there. They had, well, let me go, sorry, I got one more. So this is the embassy in Rio. So you see, here in the corner, there's the auditorium, there's the library, there's the exhibition hall. So embassies were not simply for diplomats. They were to bring people from foreign nations into the embassies to help understand the benefits of an open and free society, democracy. So what do they look like? Well, here's some of the one of the libraries in the embassies themselves. On the left is Oslo, middle is London, and on the right, small, but Havana was not a big outpost in the day. But when the London embassy was at its peak in the mid-60s, there were over 100,000 visitors annually. And what did they do? They came in and read books, they read magazines, but they also had presentations where they'd see John Wayne movies, they'd had speakers, they had lectures. It was a very dramatic effort to build cultural diplomacy, which is sometimes called soft power, because there's no arms and bombs associated with it, but it was to convince hearts and minds of the benefits of a free and open society. So what were in the exhibitions? Well, one of the single largest focuses was the abstract expressionists, as you'll see in a minute. The brochure on the right, for those of you who like art, those are the artists. So a little bit like the embassies, it was the who's who of abstract expressionists. If you tried to put that exhibition today, I don't know if you could do it. I mean, it's just, talk about a blockbuster. But it was fairly simple. On the right is an exhibition. Obviously, that's not the abstract expressionists, but it is an exhibition. That's Saarinen, London. They weren't terribly formal. It wasn't well presented necessarily. But again, it was an opportunity for foreigners to walk through an embassy and learn about America. These are some of the artists, some of the greatest artists in the world. And this is what Premier Khrushchev said about abstract expressionism. Now, why that's funny too, that painting sold recently for over $100 million. So I guess they weren't that crazy, huh? There was one last thing that the embassies used to help convince hearts and minds about the benefits of democracy, and that was music. And this is a quote from Tom Braden, who was a senior employee in the CIA in the day. Some of you may remember him as 8 Is Enough. He was Tom Braden, that show on ABC or whatever it was a cute show. But this was a statement. And why music and abstract expressionism? I'm not asking you the question. Because you didn't need an interpreter. It was rather brilliant. It was not always smooth. Louis Armstrong was an ambassador who went around the world, and finally after Little Rock and he saw how blacks were being treated in this country, particularly in the South, he resigned as a cultural ambassador. Oddly enough, unknown to many, the CIA sponsored magazines. This was a magazine in the UK, and no one at the publication knew where the money was coming from or didn't understand that it was coming from the CIA. But again, it was an opportunity to help talk about the benefits of America. And by the way, I didn't mention, people didn't know it at the time or weren't well aware of it, the CIA was housed in the embassies. In the London embassy, there were over 100 CIA agents and employees. So should we look at some of the embassies, maybe? I first want to acknowledge Jane Leffler. Jane wrote the seminal book on embassies from start to finish. She came out with a book in 1998. It was a seminal moment. There were terrorist bombs right around the date of the opening of her book in Tanzania and Kenya. She had absolutely unlimited access to the State Department files. They just said, you can see whatever you want. And then 2001 hit, and that kind of book will never be written again because no one will get access to the State Department files that she got. So she was the foundation for my book. As David said, I have a master's degree from Columbia, and Jane donated her archives to Columbia. And that's how I got interested in embassies, is because I was reading one of her articles. I realized that she had donated 9 boxes or whatever, huge boxes of her work. And she's actually become a good friend. She's a great woman. She loves to talk about the embassies. It's a really good book. It's more of a, not academic, but it's a long history of start to finish. But it's an interesting book. So one of the earliest embassies was Harrison and Bromwitz's Rio de Janeiro embassy. You can imagine what that embassy, or what the reaction of that embassy was. By the way, all of the dates here are the design dates, not the opening dates, because it often took years to get the embassies built. I'll tell you why in a minute. But that was an enormously modern, groundbreaking building in Brazil, in Rio, in the capital at the time. Rio, they since moved in 1967, they moved the capital to Brasilia. But absolutely groundbreaking building. So international style, no ornamentation, repetitive windows, rectangular, all that. I mean, look at the view. That's the view from the embassy. I mean, unheard of. So one of the early ones was also Harrison and Bromwitz. Harrison and Bromwitz, you may know, were the architects of the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Harrison and Bromwitz were on the design team for the UN. And if you look at these two buildings, I would argue there's similarities with the UN, I mean, obviously not identical, but similar patterns, similar fenestration, so forth. This building has a lot of history to it. I'll talk about it in a minute. These buildings at the beginning were largely financed through war debts. We loaned money to countries during the war, and in return, many of those countries did not want to pay us in hard currency because they didn't really want to give it up. So they gave us materials. So much of this building was travertine marble from Italy. This was an experiment, one of the first government buildings to have central air conditioning. Didn't work so well. If you see this building now, it's got all the equipment on the roof. The problem was that there was so much light and so much heat generated by the glass in that climate that they ended up having to replace the entire system. And the travertine marble did not hold up very well either. They had to replace it with a Vermont marble, so a little sturdier. Florence Knoll, as you may know, was one of the early designers for the interior of the international style buildings. Very controversial. It was considered too modern, too sleek, too progressive maybe to some degree. Obviously this is Mies van der Rohe's design, but in 1948 he gave the rights to license his furniture to Florence Knoll and Knoll Associates. But very simple. The embassy does not look like this today. Not at all. I mean, this is, but This is the ambassador's office, very simple, but kind of stark, I would say, almost. Obviously not a public room, so it was different than the lobby of the embassy. But if I can point this out, do you see? Can you see that thing here? And here, I'll show you. See that? It's hard to see here. That's a balcony. It's one of the only balconies other than the one in Rio. And that was controversial because it was considered a little bit of a aggressive move, a kind of an Eva Peron balcony for the U.S. to kind of go. So what happened in Havana? Again, I love this one because my girlfriend Evan is here. We went to Cuba 4 or 5 years ago and got to see the embassy and so forth. So it was designed by Harrison and Bravo in the early 50s, opened for a few years. Castro overthrows Batista in 1960. The embassy's closed. This is Castro's female militia. This is the day they took over, 1961, the day they took over the embassy. And Castro made it one of his headquarters, because just for the image and kind of billboard of what it meant. But we had in Cuba, we had the Bay of Pigs in 1962. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were a lot of diplomatic issues and military that made this embassy a very flashpoint for America. It was closed in 1961. It was closed for some 30 years. Obama reopened it. Trump closed it. Biden reopened it. It's gone through various stages of, can you get a visa? Can you not get a visa? The Swiss government actually managed it for almost 30 years. There was a Swiss flag flying outside instead of an American flag for many years. This is George Bush Jr. Decided to be provocative during a period in Cuba. He actually had lights and a message. See on the left, that's the embassy. And that flashed messages from Martin Luther King and President Lincoln about freedom and openness. I would call that provocative, but some people might call it something else. In response, here on the right, that's called Imperialist Plaza. Castro put up black flags to block the view of the messages. I'm going to cheat here a little bit. So that's 1950. So I think it actually opened in 1953, give or take. So obviously very international style, as I talked about. That's the Soviet embassy. Very different message. Now again, that's 1978 or 87, sorry. So different period. But that's a very totalitarian, brutalist, concrete. I mean, does that say open and inviting? Doesn't make you want to go to Russia, does it? So you can see the difference. That's why I just want to say, I mean, what does that say? Open, honest, progressive, creative. I don't think so. Ralph Rapson and Van der Meulen built a couple of the early embassies. They were actually going to build more than two, but they built one in Copenhagen. Again, very international style, 2 volumes. You'll see flat roof, no ornamentation, kind of typical. Very well received. It's still there today. This is the plan and section. I really like this one in Stockholm. Again, 2 volumes, rectilinear, very international style, no ornamentation. Very well received, even though it was super modernist. But it's a cool building. But again, that says to me, at least at the time, what is that, 70 years ago? I mean, that's a revolutionary building. That's a progressive, and again, you saw what the Soviet Union was building, not this. Again, another angle of the same Stockholm embassy. This is actually, for the architects, this is kind of what they're doing now, where they do the cantilever thing, where they do 1 volume over the next. And New Delhi, well, you, everybody probably knows New Delhi. That's kind of considered the most famous of the embassies ever built. Edward Durrell Stone, kind of a controversial architect, not because he was a bad architect, it's just some of his architecture was not liked by everybody. This was designed very much contextually for the climate. Terrazzo grill built up on a plinth to get more air. There's a courtyard, there's a lot of water. This embassy still is around. One of the reasons it's around is because it's on 30 acres. You look at some of those more urban embassies that were built to be accessible in urban environments, they're built on just a small footprint. Frank Lloyd Wright called this one of the greatest government buildings ever built. It's on the State Department's Secretary of Culturally Significant Buildings. Jackie Kennedy visited in 1962 with Ambassador Galbraith. Again, kind of a, I wouldn't say dreary, but kind of boring interior. But you can see the terrazzo grills in the background to keep the coolness in and the heat out a little bit. This is kind of an interesting point I wanted to make. The World's Fairs had a similar dynamic to the U.S. embassies. They were billboards for the progress and image of America. This is Edward Durrell Stone's pavilion in 1958. So to go back, that's rectangular. On the left, it's round, or in the model you can see it, but it's a very similar building except for the shape of it. Anyway, these buildings, the World's Fairs, were, again, opportunities to build billboards to reflect a modern open society. This was the Soviets' attempt in 1967. If any of you know the World's Fair history, what I'm going to show next. Buckminster Fuller. So you put those two together, poor the Soviet Union. They thought this was kind of revolutionary and ultra-modern. And then Buckminster Fuller comes in with a geodesic dome and just blows everybody away. It's kind of great. So that was up in Montreal. Does anybody remember that? Baghdad, Jose Luis Serre also ran the Harvard School of Design for years. Small footprint. This embassy no longer exists. It's abandoned. Karachi, Neutra, who was much better known for residential than buildings like this. I don't want to judge his building, but I think this is one of the least successful. This looks more totalitarian than it does open and accessible and progressive. I don't know, to me that looks more like the Soviet building than it does a US building, but the embassy, the Karachi is no longer the capital of Pakistan, it's now Islamabad. Oslo, Eero Saarinen, he did 2 embassies. Harrison and Bromwich also did 2. Triangular plot, concrete and Norwegian granite. And again, I showed this before, but it's got the 3 entrances. Almost all the embassies had 3 separate entrances. Kind of your average office on the right. On the left is Saarinen's spectacular atrium. The embassy in Oslo was sold in 2017, or decommissioned and then sold. Fortunately, it was purchased by a wealthy individual who's also a big supporter of preservation. The minute it was decommissioned by the U.S. government, it was landmarked by the local preservation authority. And some of you may know, embassy grounds are sovereign territory. They are considered U.S. soil. So there was nothing that the preservation community could do until the U.S. government didn't own the building anymore. I was talking to somebody earlier, maybe David or Pat, Jorge Otero Pelos, who runs the preservation program at Columbia, is a multi-talented guy, artist, architect, many things. In 2017, you'll see on the left, that fence was added after the terrorist attacks, which I'll talk about in a minute. That was added as a security measure. So that's the perimeter security fence. When the building was sold, Jorge knew the buyer, and they were just going to simply throw that in the dumpster or recycle it, whatever they're going to do. Jorge said, no, this is a preservation moment. Let me pay the costs, and I will take down the fence. And the owner said, of course, you don't have to pay for it. And Jorge had this vision to bring the sculptures, to make them into sculptures. So that he actually had those big kind of cherry picker things, whatever they call them, and he twisted and turned. This is on the right is the fence from the Oslo Embassy. And if you walk down Park Avenue across from the Armory, or two on the median on Park Avenue, and between the Seagram Building and the Lever House is another one. And this is a form, I think, for Jorge of preservation, experimental preservation, awareness for the importance of embassies. He calls it defense because it's taken away the fence, but it's a fence. You know, it's all kind of cute. Anyway, it's kind of cool. It's one of a kind. It's very creative. One of these is in front of the former U.S. Embassy in Oslo permanently. One is going to Washington next month. And I'll talk more about some of this in a minute. Accra Harry Weiss. This was, again, a much more contextual structure. This is obviously not a international style building. This was based on a Wanai palace that I'll show you in a minute. But again, a lot of this had to do with the climate. So what did he do? Well, he built it out of a local mahogany, which is ant resistant. He raised it off the ground to get the cooling breezes, and then he put a courtyard in the middle. And I'll show you. So that's the Wanai Palace. So his design influence was to turn that building upside down. It's pretty creative, right? So there's the courtyard, and that's the pool. It's empty. It was empty at the moment, but you can imagine the breezes that flow through there in the hot climate of Ghana. Another kind of typical mundane office, but the rooms that the embassies cared about were the public rooms where the public would see America. And you may know, for those of you who go to Washington, this is Harry Weiss's metro station in Washington, D.C. Athens, this is another terribly famous embassy. I love this one. I'm part Greek, so I'm a little partial to it. If you were going to pick an architect and you wanted to point the finger at communism, I would argue Walter Gropius was the single best choice you could. Why? Walter Gropius started the Bauhaus in 1919. It was shut down by the Nazis in 1933. So I don't think this was an accident that some people call it the cradle of democracy, that they chose the single most disruptive, in some ways, person in Germany in the creative era of 1919 to 1933. Gropius used the same Pentelic marble that's in the Parthenon. I thought that was kind of cool. Gropius, some of you may know, he designed the Pan Am building, now the MetLife building. This is a landmark. It's on the Secretary of State's Register of Historically Significant Property. This one is in the process of being updated and renovated. Again, this one will be forever, I think, because it's on a very big plot of land, so they can protect it adequately. The problem when you saw Severn's London Embassy, that was built on Grosvenor Square, beautiful site, one of the great sites in London, I think. It should have been an American center when they sold it, but whatever, we can talk about that. They could never adequately protect it. They put up bollards, they closed the street, they put up security boxes, but it never worked. Again, courtyard for the cooling effect of the climate. It was an absolute square. This is an aerial view in the early 70s. I guess plagiarism, so best form of compliment. But this is Oscar Niemeyer's palace in Brazil that I think has very, very similar design elements to that. But that's just me. And Oscar Niemeyer was also involved in the UN building. So London, Aero Saarinen, one of the great embassies ever, I think. Precast concrete, he won a competition against 7 other individuals. Saarinen, as you may know, did the TWA terminal at JFK, St. Louis Arch, Ingalls Ring at Yale. He's done a lot of great buildings. This building was controversial when it was built. He actually scaled it to the neighborhood to make it more contextual. I think it's a great embassy. That's what it looked like not long after it opened. I'll talk about that eagle in a minute. Oh, I'm actually going to talk about it now. So that's a 36-foot eagle by Theodore Roszak, which was incredibly controversial. That's an eagle, American eagle. I don't know if it's American, but it's an eagle to represent, obviously, the symbol of America. That was considered aggressive and overburdened for that building. Everybody can have their own. But that's Roszak building the sculpture in 1959. By the way, that sculpture still adorns the building, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Again, typical ambassadors. I mean, nothing was special in these offices. They were small, kind of compact. Again, the meeting rooms were, and then the public area was where people wanted to go. This is the Hague, Marcel Breuer, who did the Whitney trapezoidal windows, reinforced concrete and German limestone. Again, 3 entrances. I'll show you in a minute. Unusual though, right? I mean, you don't look at that and think of the Soviet Union. Although it's a little brutalist, but it's got a energy and it's got a creativity to it. Again, here, let's see if you can see it. So that's one of the entrances, another one on this side, and then there's one over here. Oh, there it is, sorry. So I forgot I had this. So there's the auditorium. That's the library. And these are offices here, but you can see the different entrances that you'd come into. I don't know if anybody's been to New Haven recently, but this was Marcel Breuer's Armstrong Rubber Building, completely renovated. It's now apparently a good hotel. I don't know. I don't go to New Haven much, but for those who do, I'd be curious to see it. Caracas, Don Hatch, 1957. Harry Bertoia did the metal panels on the exterior. Again, art important in embassies, very important. Those are those panels not many years ago, spectacular. Some of you may recognize the similar pattern panels. Those are in the Skidmore, Owens and Merrill building on 5th Avenue and maybe 44th, 45th, the old bank building. It's that one where you see the big round safe in the window. Anyway, those panels are still there because they're considered, I don't know if they're landmarked or they just say that. And John F. Kennedy was the first president in 1962 ever to visit Venezuela. Unfortunately, relations with Venezuela are not where they were in those days. Dublin, I love this embassy. This is a cool embassy. Celtic design, round. John Johansson, again, one of the Harvard Five. I'll talk about some of his other work. But how cool is that? I mean, that's what you walk into, unlike any other building. Interesting thing, this is, again, messaging. So the Oslo embassy was built on a triangular plot, but Saarinen built a triangular building. This is on a triangular plot, but Johansson built a circular building. Why? Because it's got a little Celtic influence of the round kind of moats and fortresses a little bit. But his primary design influence or motivation was he wanted to send a message that America never turns its back on anybody. So there's no back, there's no... This was one of those embassies that, and it's one of the reasons why the embassy building program slowed down in the early 60s. These buildings were a little edgy, they were a little controversial, there was a lot of design independence, and in fact, the Dublin Embassy took 7 years to get built from design, and it took John F. Kennedy to write a letter to, was it Wayne Hayes, representative, to basically say, stop complaining and go away, this building's going to get built. But that's how much reaction and how much influence these buildings have had. And interesting note, this is a Jeopardy question, but one female architect designed an embassy, Clotilde Smith, and in Paraguay. It's not there anymore, but... So let's take a quick look at where are these embassies today and what's going on. As I mentioned, the same year that Jane's book came out in 1998, there were twin terrorist bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, both the U.S. embassies. Many lives lost, and they happened within 30 seconds of each other. Changed the world. Changed the world in terms of embassy design, embassy security. There was a comment when the embassy, Saarinen embassy opened in London, that somebody remembered an 80-year-old security guard with a cane standing in the front door. That was the only security guard. And until terrorism brought up its ugly head, the thing that the embassies worried most about was listening devices, espionage. So all the embassies had safe, quiet rooms, things like that. But nobody was thinking, when they built these buildings in dense urban environments, to be accessible, open, you could just walk into them. So for the very reason they were built, they became obsolete. And so how did we react? Well, we didn't react well, at least in terms of design. And I guess you can't blame the State Department, but with so many lives lost, security became the #1 issue when they were thinking about building these buildings. And what does that mean? Well, they came up with design requirements like 100-foot setbacks, minimum of 6-acre sites, fenestration, the windows, doors could only be more than 15% on the principal facade. But what did that really mean? That means that you can't build a 6-acre embassy in downtown London. There's no sites. You just can't do it. So you need the big footprint to be able to protect these buildings adequately. How good a job did we do? I'll leave it to you. To me, that looks like a prison. These were called Fortress America. That's what the response was. And you can't blame the State Department. I mean, you've got to protect your people. So at the time, and remember, then you had 2001, you had you had all that, and so it was a hyper anxiety time for security, and like a lot of those things, they kind of went over to one side. That's Kazakhstan. Equally corporate. I don't know what the right word is. Afghanistan. I think that wall is 30 feet high. It doesn't exactly say, welcome, why don't you come to our library and read a few books. By the way, after 2001, all the cultural diplomacy in the embassies were shut down. So you can no longer go to a U.S. Embassy library. There's no more auditoriums to see. There's no art exhibitions. None of that's all gone. So this is kind of where they are today. It's a lot on one slide, sorry about that. But basically the takeaway here is of the 25 plus, about 7 remain. Most have been sold or abandoned. Again, the primary focus after terrorist attacks was security. So here we are. This is Baghdad, 15 or so, 14 years ago, abandoned. Jose Luis Sert's building. This is Neutra's building, abandoned. So of the embassies that have been purchased and repurposed, there are some success stories. London is not one of them. It was purchased by an investment fund. I'm embarrassed to say, because I love architecture and I love this embassy. I was staying with Evan in Grosvenor Square, and this is a grade 2 building. And I thought they were just doing a light renovation to get ready to do what they wanted to do. I didn't realize that they gutted the whole building and only left 3 facades. And I walked down the street, I mean, it's embarrassing to say, and I started crying. I had tears. I looked at this building, I said, this is an American asset. How can you do that? And it was sweet. One of the doormen walked over to me and put his arm around me and said, are you okay? And I said, I'm okay, but I'm an American, and I love architecture, and I love preservation. He goes, I know. Aren't they assholes what they did? And it's not just that. You know, there's this thing, and you guys probably know this design, facadism in London, where they just keep the facades and they think that's fine, and that's a way of preservation. That's horseshit, but anyway. This is what it's going to be. It's a rendering, obviously. It's going to be a restaurant and bar and hotel. But they played shenanigans. So for those who've got a good eye, this is a whole new floor. That's all new fenestration. It's so out of proportion with the rest. All those were the same proportion previously. Look at that. I mean, it's just bastardized the building. And then they built the top floor on top, but this is where they played quick and cool. They said, well, in order to get the building, we're going to do a bar on the top, and we can raise it up a little bit, and for that, we're going to allow the public to come up, and the view of Grosvenor Square in London is going to be great. About 6 months after they started the construction, they realized that there was no way to, allegedly, adequately provide security for people to get up there without going in different places in the building that made security a challenge. So they said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. But they got this building built, and there was no penalty. So in my view, that's not a success story. I mean, 3 walls exist, but Sovern would be climbing out of his grave. Oslo, now that's another story. Oslo, I think, is a great success story and actually a model for what you can do and can't do when it comes to American assets and this is a landmark building, but for those of you with the preservation, you can only landmark a building by the local landmarking, or the country can do it. But what happened? So I don't know if any of you have seen this. This was February's issue of Architectural Record. That's the Oslo Embassy after it was purchased, renovated, and repurposed as offices and other, I'll show you in a minute. But that's pretty cool. It made the cover of Architectural Record. So that's the atrium that you saw before. So virtually untouched, very much restored. New interiors, but a lot of the wood was restored. They spent an enormous amount of money. There's a restaurant open to the public. To me, it's not ideal, but it's close. As I said before, I would love to see these buildings become American cultural centers, but so be it. So I think that's a big win. So want to probably end on a more positive note to some degree. Those are the embassies that have some kind of landmark status, but again, the degree of landmark status depends on the restrictions. So as I just talked about, London was a grade 2. If it had been a grade 1, they wouldn't have been able to do anything they did. But it should have been a grade 1 building. That's actually I actually own that stamp. That's a real stamp on the left from The Hague. That's how much they admire that building in The Hague. Let's take a look at the new embassies, and then I'll finish, because I'm actually very encouraged about what's going on. I'll preface it by saying we went from high aesthetics, high billboard value, high creativity, to terrorist attacks, security is most important. We don't care if it looks like a prison. That didn't work very well, and now we're kind of swinging back the other way. I'm very, very encouraged. And former Senator Patrick Moynihan, whose name is now on the former Farley Post Office across from Penn Station, was a big supporter of architecture and preservation, particularly in New York State and New York City. And I thought he said what he said pretty well about the importance of architecture. So let's take a quick look. This is Kieran Timberlake's new embassy in 9 Elms in London. It's controversial, let's put it that way. Everybody has their opinion. It's called the Ice Cube. Some of those features by the windows are actually to help for environmental, to block the sun and so forth. But there is a moat around part of it, and that's intentional. I don't quite understand it, but, and I should remember, I can't remember, but I think this is 8 or 10 acres. 9 Elms is a brand new development, 40 minutes from the city. Apparently the ambassador in London, who lives in that wonderful Winfield house in, I can't remember the park, Regent's Park, 16 acres or something. It's one of the largest private homes in London. Has most of her meetings at the house because nobody wants to go to the embassy. It takes too far, and it's much more fun to go to Winfield House because it's so cool. Malawi, again, feels a lot more creative, a lot more inviting, a lot more modern. Vietnam, this one's going to be finished next year. But again, it feels open, creative. This is getting a lot of attention. It's going to be open soon. Yeah, I like this one a lot. Congo, again, kind of contextual, a lot more sensitive to the local materials and so forth. And finally, my favorite architect in America, wait. Jeannie Gang. I just think she's a rock star. And this is her new, she may be doing one more in Brazil. So as I said earlier, in 1967, they moved the capital of Brazil to Brasilia. But again, that feels a lot more modern and inviting and so forth. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take a few questions.
Unless I'm mistaken, I didn't see the huge eagle in the new ones.
You mean in London?
Was there?
They put it in the top.
No, they're not there.
Sorry.
Oh, that one.
Yeah.
But no, that's not the new London one.
See, it's up there. You can't
Oh,
see
there
it.
it is.
See, there.
No, that's now the restaurant.
No, up top here.
The eagle is up
Yeah,
there.
I know.
See there.
But are they allowed, I noticed that, but are they allowed to keep the eagle even though it's no longer an embassy?
It was considered part of the grade 2 facade. We can argue about whether it was an American asset that should have been taken down, but the argument was that it was a significant part of the pre-existing facade. I think it's kind of odd. I think it's odd.
Yeah.
Well, it's a commercial building, and the eagle represents America and a time. It's just not a, and it was bought by I think a Saudi investment group. Not that it matters who bought it, but you know, I don't know. It feels a little out of place. Maybe a little tone deaf almost, right?
We have a question over here.
Hi. How much oversight did the State Department have over the architect's party? So, for example, in the Dublin plan, it's this radial plan with this idea of America doesn't turn its back on anyone. For the other embassies, did the State Department say, okay, this is the idea or ethic we want to express, and we want you to put that in plan?
It's a great question. essentially what happened right around the end of the 1940s is that this was kind of a concept of the State Department. There was a division called the Foreign Buildings Office. It's now called the Overseas Building Office, that came up with this idea and kind of floated it, and nobody really knew what to think of it, and they had a lot of leeway. Basically, in Rio, Havana, Stockholm, Copenhagen, those early embassies, there was absolutely nothing. They got to build what they got to build. When the Florence Knoll furniture went in Havana, people started to notice that maybe it was a little edgier. And that's actually, it's a good question, yes. That's why the Architectural Review Committee was put together, because the State Department wanted some oversight over the future buildings. And those buildings were edgy. I mean, not today they're not edgy, but considering that most of the prior embassy-oriented spaces were neoclassical, traditional buildings, it was, I don't want to say push the edges, but it certainly woke people up a little bit.
Any other questions? No?
Well, David, thank you so much. Appreciate this. Was
Thank
really
you.
informative, educational, and I'm glad we're ending on a little note of hope. So everyone, please join us in our gallery space, and we can continue the conversation and have a drink and some nibbles. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Oh, maybe hot mic here. Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Yes, yes. I kept thinking of Jackie redoing the White House at the same time with all this Louis XVI furniture.
Oh, you're exactly right. Good, yeah.
But it's also the State Department has mid-century building filled with George III room. That's such an
Yeah, I know. Hi, David
I'm
Peterson.
Mariana.
Nice to meet you.
Nice meeting you. I was wondering why you didn't include IMP's building in Uruguay, Embassy, U.S. Embassy in Montevideo.
That was built in 65-ish, so I did, mine was 1948 to 1962.
Oh, okay.
So that was kind of the core period of the Cold War.
Okay.
And I couldn't write about every embassy, so
No, because you showed a building by Gropius, was it?
yeah.
That was very similar. It was shockingly
Oh, okay.
similar.
I can look. I know I have it in my file somewhere. Do I need to
Did
put
include
on?
my country, Caracas, Venezuela.
That's a cool. That's I should have mentioned. That's no longer an embassy.
No, it's the government.
I've got a little tape on that too. Yeah.
It's still intact.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the Bortorio panels as well.
Are you talking about the Venezuela?
Yeah, you're
That's what I
there.
want to know. Well, I grew up there, so
Grew up in Caracas? I'm from there.
She was also wondering where she would get a book.
I come and go. I was in New York.
I was like, you should have
I
asked
have a
that
place
question.
to get there.
Yeah. I was like, a QR code would have been fantastic. No, of course. You could have, though.